Hello there, John Coturillo here, the life coach of your listener. Thank you for joining us for this episode. It's my pleasure today to welcome my guest, Jasmine Bibby. Jasmine is a fantastic professional photographer who creates wedding, family, portrait, commercial, and boudoir images in a stunning sense. Jasmine and I actually met some years ago when we both studied at university together, and having worked with her, I've witnessed just how skillful she is at being able to help you feel at ease and allow you to have your best self captured in her images. Now, a central theme in Jasmine's boudoir photography is the idea that images of ourselves can empower us. And one of the most important gifts that she gives to her clients is the empowerment that comes from seeing themselves portrayed in such a beautiful fashion. And as someone myself who is very much attuned to emotions and is fascinated by how they manifest and how we relate to our emotions and other people's emotions, I was honored to ask her to be a guest on my program today and discuss her thoughts on emotions and the part that emotions play in her work and in her life. So without further ado, here's our discussion. Jasmine, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. And also thank you to the stars of the show, our precious pooches, for joining us. Jasmine, you're a photographer with a considerable history. Tell us about Vivid Studios and the concept.
I'm a boudoir photographer. Boudoir photography is technically like lingerie photography in a studio typically, but I do it to empower at most typically women, especially because after childbirth or just like going through life, it is very easy for us to lose our confidence in ourselves. So with boudoir photography, because you are in your lingerie and everything, you have nowhere to hide. So all your images are really empowering because you know that it's 100% you. It just builds confidence and empowers people when they do a shoot. So that's why I love it.
So your craft is very much an interactive and it's a multifaceted one. It's artwork that actually goes beyond entertaining or captivating other people. It's also to captivate the subjects as well.
Yeah, exactly. So we kind of do it to show people how others see them because like sometimes we just don't see ourselves the way other people see us. So when you look at a photo of yourself, it's a different kind of reaction because sometimes they don't see them as themselves. So when like you point out that that actually is them, then they feel really empowered by that.
So the key concept in the work that you do is the idea of empowerment and validation, and that's the topic that I'd love to discuss with you today. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've had a personal journey with, and that if that inspired you to want to integrate it into the craft that you practice.
Like, yes, I think everyone has gone through phases where like you don't like this and that and everything about yourself, whether it's like your physical appearance or your personality or something like that. I did do 2 photo shoots just as like research. I did them a few years ago, back in maybe 2019, to see what it was like to be on the other side of the camera. But I absolutely loved it because I use those images to build confidence in myself. And it does take a while to accept who you are. And there's multiple different ways that can happen in life. And I know my partner, he helps with that as well, just by having someone else that loves you for exactly who you are. That can definitely make an impact as well.
Being on the other side of the camera, when you were able to see the results of that, perhaps there was a moment that said, that's something that I'd like to be able to do for other people because I can see just how powerful it is.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to be honest, the first thing that drew me to boudoir photography was the creativeness of it. So when you do like family photos, you can still be creative and everything, but there's a lot more limitations because like you got to capture that family. But when you do boudoir, you can have a lot, because you're working with adults, you can be a lot more creative. So that's what first drew me to it. But then I saw the reaction that I got from my clients, and that's what's kept me going through some of the harder times, because when you're in your own business, there are definitely hard times. So that's what's actually driven me forward.
They're precious moments when somebody obtains so much from what you do for them. In this case, it'd be joy or support or feeling validated. It really validates what you do as well, makes you want to continue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Especially so I had a client who's come from a pretty difficult relationship and just got out of it. So she did this for herself just to show that she is still worthy and to feel good about herself again, because someone else had taken that from her. Watching her look at her images was just absolutely incredible.
Good on you. And I can imagine how much impact that would have had on her, and perhaps a good portion of her life is all the better for the confidence that she developed just by looking at those images.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. Yeah.
Well, that leads us to perhaps one of life's big questions, the role of validation and other people's acceptance in our life. Because a lot of people treat this as something that's nice to have. They treat it as something that makes us feel nice, but isn't really an essential ingredient. I'm wondering what different opinions are on the role of validation. What does it do for us?
As much as you should empower yourself, I think getting validated from other people definitely builds confidence faster. And just having other people around you that validate your opinions or the way you look or just love you for who you are, it can definitely help you excel more in life and achieve your goals. And if you have to find it 100% internally, I think that that's quite difficult.
Do you feel you've always had a good relationship with your own feelings and a good balance between receiving confidence in your interactions with other people versus receiving confidence from within entirely?
Growing up, you don't really learn how to fully understand your emotions until much later in life, when you become an adult. So definitely through my teen years, did things that probably weren't the best decision to make, especially on social media or just going through school. You say things that are very emotional that you probably shouldn't have said. Now that I'm an adult, I definitely am more in tune with my emotions. I do like to understand why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. Sometimes I don't understand why I'm feeling the way I am. So I like to analyze that and discuss it with my partner and try and get to the reason. Yeah, so I feel like I'm quite in tune with my emotions more as an adult because I put the effort in to try and understand them, so I don't lash out and say things that I don't mean or react in a way that's not helpful.
Oh, that's one of the most adaptive responses to emotions that we can have. I think you have the makings of an emotional coach right there, Jasmine, that everyone can benefit from that insight.
Each to their own, but some people like to be quite reactive. They kind of like the drama, but I like a easier life. So yeah, when things happen, I like to know why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling and then how best to react to that so I don't cause problems in the future. I don't say the wrong thing to someone and react negatively. Obviously, it still happens. We're all human, but it definitely helps get through. And I find that if you're positive in the way you react to different situations, then more positive things happen and things just become a bit easier.
I think that's one of the most important analyses of emotion that people can make. The more close and comfortable you get to your emotions and the more you're able to understand why they exist, the better you are able to have a positive relationship with them that's compassionate rather than ambivalence.
Yeah, exactly. The other day, I did an expo, and it was my first expo that I've ever done. It was a bridal one. And I was quite nervous about doing that. So I was packing the car and I forgot a few things. And so I was putting all that together and I was quite stressed. My partner was helping me, which is awesome. And because I was stressed, there was a few times where I almost lashed out, even though he was being really helpful. He did nothing wrong. But because I knew that I was stressed and I knew why I was stressed, I kept telling myself, I was stay calm, it's all good. And if you've got nothing positive to say, don't say anything. So there was times where I was just quiet because if I lashed out, then that would have caused problems. Whereas because I knew why I was feeling the way I was feeling, I prevented that.
Thanks for sharing that, Jasmine. That's an incredible level of insight you have, and that type of mindfulness is really amazing in the human experience. It really helps us. That's fantastic. You're letting me reflect on my own experiences actually with emotion, where I think when I was younger, I found it easier to validate other people's emotions than I did to understand or validate my own. I could understand why people might feel a certain way. In many ways, I didn't know what some of the feelings were that I was having. I don't think I realised until recent years when I started to gain the insight that I did that I really started to realise what impact our emotions actually have on us.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot going on in the world about gender, but men and women can experience emotion differently. Growing up, women definitely have more emotions or they show more emotions than the men that were around. So potentially, because like I cry at the drop of a hat if I'm very, 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 very happy, or if I'm really sad, or like, yeah. So I show my emotion a lot. I'm not very subtle with my emotions. But because of that, I think I'm able to understand them a bit more. Whereas if you hide them more, and I think they're harder to understand because if you don't want to show them, which a lot of men don't want to show their emotions, then I think they're harder to understand than if you just show them, release them, and let it happen.
Being able to work with emotions in a healthy manner is important to being able to using them when it's appropriate and being able to control them when you need to. Whereas if you have a level of control that's either too lax or too tight, it can affect you in ways that eventually overall lessen your control and make the relationship with your emotions much worse. Because if you always feel the need to suppress them, or always feel like they're going to control you in some way, then you're not sitting with them compassionately.
Yeah. Whereas they're part of being human, so you kind of just need to accept them to then be able to understand what's going on.
One of the most important messages that people need to understand, I think, that if Mother Nature wanted us to be completely emotionless, then by extension we wouldn't be social animals, because in every place in the world, I believe, that there's some type of manifestation of one person supporting another, usually many people supporting many others. Really, our emotions, if they didn't have a purpose, then they wouldn't exist. In fact, they act as internal signals. And something really interesting happens when one person shows another person empathy, is that the person who's receiving it actually becomes neurologically more likely to be able to solve problems. Their brain actually recognizes it. Seemingly, if we personified it, the brain seems to recognize it as a signal that says, I can trust this person, I can relax my guard and focus on dealing with whatever it is I have to deal with in this moment. So it's not just a nice feeling, it's actually changing our mechanics when we show someone empathy. It's quite incredible.
There was this video that I saw that was about how important HR is in a workplace. Like, if we didn't have emotion, then part of HR's job would be kind of irrelevant, because HR is there to make sure that we're feeling okay and we're happy in the job that we're in. And so the video was about how he puts a lot of emphasis on HR, because people want to feel comfortable and feel happy, and that's when they do the best work. So if there's something in that work environment that's causing people to be unhappy, then that needs to be removed. So it's really important how emotion makes us more productive if it's used correctly. Like, if we're feeling happy and safe and we want to work, then you're definitely a lot more productive. HR, I don't think, would be anywhere near as important if we didn't have emotion and if it didn't affect other things in our life.
Exactly. That's an excellent example. And from the perspective of employment and productivity as a society, in and of itself, that's a incredibly strong reason to acknowledge the importance of emotions and working with them healthily. But even at a grander societal level, productivity, it goes beyond that to how we produce meaningful ideas in our life, produce meaningful phenomena like pursuing our missions, creating things, creating good relationships. All that is productive in some way. And if our relationship with emotion in the workplace is that important, then for society it must be many times more important.
In life, you want to feel good, you want to feel like happy and accomplished, and that's kind of what you try and do every day. So something as simple as helping your neighbour or doing other things to help society plays a huge role in everything that we do.
Again, I think it's a signal that is just a demonstration. That's a good example that you gave, helping a neighbour, helping other members of society. It's a good demonstration of how really those emotions are signals when something is being done that's good and when something that's being done that may be not so good. And it's definitely part of being a healthy, adaptive human to actually help people, because the more we help people, not only are we doing what's right by them, we as a society thrive more when each of us takes some responsibility for helping each other. I'm wondering how that also relates to the role of validation. Validation is something that's been spoken about massively in the field of emotions, especially when it comes to child psychology and developmental psychology, because again, validation, just like emotion, it has a role beyond just making people feel good. It's a signal to us that somebody else cares, that somebody else has our best interests at heart.
Yeah, and I think you can be more adventurous, take more risk in life if you've got someone who validates you. So if that's like your parent, or like as a child, if that's your parent, like if there's someone that appreciates you as a person and like is a safe place for you to be, then you can go out and take more risk. And so that works in adulthood as well. If you've got a safe place to come back to, then you can just reach out a bit further and take more risks. Yeah, and that can help get like more validations. To say if it means that you can get go for the promotion at work and be more validated at work or anything like that, definitely helps having the base that's quite strong.
And we could say that it's fundamental to us to be able to learn to live in the world and interact with the world. If no one ever supported us in anything, then we wouldn't have any healthy sense of what's worth pursuing and what's not pursuing, because we tend to internalize what we see in the world from a young age, and those lessons stay with us essentially for the rest of our life. So unless we do something to modify them through means such as therapy or psychotherapy. But what often happens is if a child doesn't experience a healthy sense of validation, I won't say over-validation because that in itself has its own problems, but a healthy sense of validation, what often happens is they're not taught to discern what's healthy from what's not healthy. The message that they've been sent their entire childhood is your emotions aren't healthy, or you aren't healthy, or something's wrong with you. And if that's the only message you receive, then there's nothing that you can use to judge how to live your life, because according to the lessons you've learned, everything that you do and everything you are is just an unhealthy being.
And I think social media is playing a huge role in this as well, because you jump onto social media and if you've got an extra like or an extra comment or more views, then you get that instant validation. Yeah, so social media, I think, is definitely changing how, especially like, because you can have it from the age of 13, how adolescents get validation.
Exactly, and there's been major discussions about whether allowing adolescents to get that validation at that age is potentially doing more harm than good, because forms of validation hold meaning for the people receiving them. So getting a like on social media is a lot different from a parent taking the time to validate what you feel or something you've done. It doesn't have the same quality, does it?
Yeah, and I think that if you're constantly getting a lot of validation online, then real life becomes a bit more dull, because not much is real online. Like, you've got filters and you've got Photoshop and you've got all these different, like, AI makes it super easy just to fake so much these days, that I think it's very easy for the constant validation of social media to make real life quite mundane, which is kind of sad.
It dilutes it in a sense. It spoils it.
Yeah, because if making your appearance seem what you would consider like better, and then you look in the mirror is going to seem really dull and boring and not appealing. Whereas social media, because of the filters, you might really like that. That's quite unhealthy.
It's a form of hedonism. It's judging what is good by how it makes you feel rather than what it does for you. And so in that case, maybe because it's a false sense of validation, it's almost a type of guilty pleasure. It might make you feel good in the moment, but what it actually does for your psychology in the long term is probably not desirable if you were to be able to see what the projection was.
Exactly. And if you're getting good validation on social media from this fake version of you, then if you're not getting that in real life or as much, because people don't just go around and go, oh, like that's weird. Then I think that can definitely have a negative impact on people.
Something else that's been dominating the discussion recently, which again, it's for good reason, it's been probably neglected throughout history, is the relationships between how well we deal with our emotions and our overall mental health. And I think also people tend to pigeonhole mental health as being something that's only relevant to mental illness, and that you really shouldn't be concerned about it unless you have a mental illness of some description or you're starting to show signs of that.
Yeah, mental health is something that, yeah, we're definitely talking about heaps more these days than we ever used to. But it comes up all the time. Like every single day you wake up and you could be in a good mood, you could be in a bad mood, and that affects everything that you do. I think your mental health impacts how your day goes, and it's definitely a lot more than mental illness. Yeah, definitely, I agree.
I think it's been consistently demonstrated throughout different studies and different observations that you need a good relationship with your emotions in order to maintain optimal being, in order to have good mental health overall, which is not to say that if you don't have a good relationship with your emotions, that it's inherently your fault. Often, if you don't have a good relationship, it might be a result of what you were taught as a child. It might be a result of trauma. It might be a result of an illness that's affecting the way you live your daily life. But I'm aiming this more at the people who might deny the importance of emotion, because sometimes when your emotions are so strong, I think everyone can testify to a particular moment where their emotions were so strong that they lost ability to concentrate, to remember what they were thinking about just a moment ago, to even think of words to say or remember how to do something basic.
Yeah, and for something to be able to just take over like everything, like take over all your thoughts and everything, it's got to be something that's really powerful. So it needs to be something that not can be controlled, like sort of controlled, but understood, and used to the best of our abilities and stuff.
Exactly. And even people who don't necessarily acknowledge the importance of emotion or might not give them much credence, there's a guarantee that they feel them in some way. Most people, at the very least, the vast majority, if not everyone, feels emotion in some way. Even if you don't recognize something as an emotion, the likelihood is that you're still processing internal emotions that are internal signals that are telling you something, whether it's telling you that something needs to change, or whether it's telling you that something you did was good or something you did was bad, or you should be paying attention to something. Often there is some feeling that you internalize that's a signal, and it will be an emotion, even if you don't see it as an emotion.
Yeah, and even if you go back to like survival mode, just feeling frightened means that something is not quite right. So you need to get out of that situation. Yeah, even if you're not in survival mode, just having emotion can tell you that something's right or wrong.
Exactly. Like we said, they have a purpose. So when you have them, it's best to acknowledge them and learn how to deal with them adaptively, because when we don't develop a healthy relationship with them, then they can take control of us in ways that are not so desirable and perhaps might cause us harms. And if we're parents, teach our children to have good relationships with their emotions as well.
Kids see what's around them and act upon that. So like if you are frustrated at a barista, for example, and shout at them, a kid will see that and potentially do the same thing. But you tell the kid off for that, so you shouldn't be doing that yourself as well. So if you're trying to teach someone else how to do something, you have to show it as well in your day-to-day life.
Absolutely. We're not born into the world knowing some of even what we consider the most fundamental facts about how to live life. So if a child is to grow into a healthy adult, they need to see healthy behaviors, and they need to see the consequences as well. They need to see and be taught why it's so good to be a healthy human. Like, why is it good to control your emotions when it's appropriate to do so, and not show other people anger or not show other people unkindness? Show them what happened, what it does for that other person when you're kind to them and when you're respectful to them, and show them what happens when you express your emotions in a healthy way, like talking to your spouse in a respectful manner at a time when you might feel upset.
Growing up makes a huge difference, and having a safe place to express the emotions as well, because there's no point just controlling them and never letting show emotion. There's definitely a balance. So you have to know when to let out your emotions and when to maybe like hold back a little bit sometimes.
Whether we like it or not, emotions are a part of being human. We have to have a good relationship with them. The fact that they affect us so deeply should be a sign within itself that the healthiest thing to do is not to deny them, but to have a good relationship with them, and to acknowledge that being considerate of other people's emotions is actually part of a healthy functioning society. because it's a signal to each person that you can trust, that they can trust you, and vice versa. It's helping somebody else survive in a way that you'd want them to help you survive. It's part of being human.
Understanding your own emotions and how you feel and stuff like that also helps you understand other people, because like if someone, for example, is being really quiet in a stressful situation, then if that's something that you also do, you can be like, okay, well, they're being quiet because like they don't want to lash out or anything like that. Then you can kind of understand other people's emotions and potentially like change your behavior or just react differently to people, and maybe not take offense if someone's displaying behavior in a particular way.
Absolutely. It's part of having discretion to be able to act preemptively or proactively and make an intuitive prediction about what might be happening in a situation and act in a way that minimizes any drama, because that person might be feeling negatively, and perhaps being too reactive to that or drawing attention to it could make them feel worse and could potentially cause them great harm. So knowing how to sometimes divert attention away from the situation to protect people is definitely a good life skill to have.
Yeah. Understanding your emotions and someone else's can, not add fuel to a fire.
That's the upside of emotion and validation and our relationships with emotion. There is also a flip side to it, and there are a few different facets of it. One of them is there seems to be something of a culture war. It's probably existed for many years. I'm not sure if it's existed in the form that it has today, but which there's a constant conflict for and against emotional kindness, because there are some people who still genuinely believe that emotions are superfluous. They're just parts of us that we can ignore, and that anytime we acknowledge them, we're showing weakness. In fact, some people even extend that to say that mental illness doesn't even exist, that a lot of acknowledged mental illnesses are not real mental illnesses. Some people say anxiety can't be a mental illness, or being depressed can't be a mental illness. I find that quite concerning.
Yeah, I think social media has definitely played a very negative part in this. Because of social media, some people do cry wolf. They look at something on social media and like they self-diagnose. Other people see so many different people, like see cases of anxiety or cases of different mental illnesses increase absolutely rapidly. And then they see some people cry wolf. I think some people are a bit more skeptical because social media has made it quite predominant and sometimes easy for people to fake.
People do often tend to use mental illness related terminology or ideas in ways that don't accurately reflect the situation to which they're referring.
For example, some people might just be having a bad day, like a few things have just not gone right, and so they feel really down and they're like, oh, I'm depressed. And so I think that's why some people go, oh, well, then that's not true, because there's a lot of false information out there.
So there's certainly nothing wrong with acknowledging false information, and indeed critiquing false information is actually part of a healthy society, because as we said with validation, if everything is a mental illness, then it completely defeats the purpose of actually diagnosing and treating people who have conditions that actually affect their lives, because then it becomes just a conceptualization of being human, which doesn't achieve its purpose. So it's quite damaging to people who actually have mental illnesses if we use those terms too loosely.
Yeah,
exactly.
If someone's just feeling a bit down and they're like, I'm depressed, then someone who actually is depressed and has been diagnosed with that, there's a different weight on that, and people might perceive it differently.
Critiquing those types of inaccuracies is extremely important. But what we also have to critique is, number one, the misuse of the concept of validation. So perhaps using emotions or working with emotions in a way that's not so healthy, even if it does seem nice on face value. But another is also acknowledging the source of this belief that emotions aren't important. And you mentioned something earlier that's really that's an important and interesting part of this discussion, is that men often don't express emotions as freely as women do. It just statistically tends to be more of a feminine quality than a masculine quality. And there's a couple of ways we could theorize that works. One is that men can be taught not to show emotion, which is often the case. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people acknowledge it online, that if they're men, or even if they're women just observing men, that men get taught when they're young, or they see when they're young, men not showing emotion. And from that, they learn well, dad's not showing emotion, or these men aren't showing emotion, it must be bad to show emotion. And they make their interpretation. The young mind's incredible. It's like a sponge. It absorbs all this information. They make their own interpretations of that, and they see that, or they get told by important men in their lives, men don't cry.
Exactly. And that's why some things take quite a few generations to change, because if fathers are teaching their sons particular behavior, then that son will then teach his son. So it takes quite a few generations. So even if it changes slightly, then by maybe the fourth or fifth generation, that's when you start actually seeing some change. Because if it's only slight per generation, then it takes quite a while to change.
When we change, we want to make sure that any change we're making isn't too radical from what we're familiar with, which again, going from not acknowledging emotion to all of a sudden respecting emotion isn't a bad thing, but humans just tend to be conservative. They tend to want to anchor to a safe home and not be too radical. So that's why the change takes so long. But yeah, you're right. Sometimes it can take multiple generations before a man in the family finally has a healthy relationship with his own emotions and others' emotions too.
Yeah, and cultural differences make, like, there's a lot of cultural differences in it as well. Like some cultures accept men crying a bit more than other cultures.
Mm.
Yeah, so that also makes a bit of a difference as well.
Culture's an important point, which we can integrate into this discussion, because one of the other perspectives on the differences between men and women in the way that they show emotion is that there can also be biological differences. Men can have certain neurological developments that are different to how a woman's brain develops, and maybe there's a biological predisposition. And sometimes that has an evolutionary purpose, but also sometimes we can exaggerate the effect to which is important. So, for example, in an evolutionary history, perhaps men were required to be less affected by emotion so that they could take care of certain survival needs of the tribe. But then that only serves a purpose when it's necessary to survive in the most trying times. In moments when it's actually more healthy to acknowledge emotion, then it works against us, doesn't it? Because it's actually taking something away from us.
Yeah, whereas like back in tribal times, it was the women's job to care for everyone and care for the children, so to show the emotion. A really interesting statistic has come out that men in like the millennial generation are a lot more hands-on with raising their kids than they ever used to be. So I think that that's part of them showing more emotion. It's not that other dads didn't care, it's just they showed it differently. So I think being more in touch with your emotion, you're able to help out more with your kids and be more present in their life.
Exactly. I was actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was actually just going to mention that some traditional views of child rearing can be at odds with themselves, because some will argue that a child needs a biologically male and a biologically female co-parent, and they need the influence of both in their lives in order to develop into a mentally healthy and human being. But if the traditional view of child rearing is only that women take most of the care role and men take less of it, I wonder how much of an influence the man is going to have in that child's development if the woman is taking most of that role. Because if we need influence from both men and women in order to develop in a normal fashion, logically speaking, both have to be equally involved in that, in your development in some way. Like, you need to see the qualities of your mother and the qualities of your father, and to be able to see clearly where they fit into the world.
I think it's a very, I guess, like old school way of thinking, because like you get interaction with men and women throughout life. Like that's just how the world works. There's almost 50-50 in the world with men and women. Both genders obviously help raise people, but I don't think it matters which one is your parent or parents.
There are a certain number of qualities which make up a healthy human being, and both men and women can have those qualities, even if, statistically speaking, either a man or a woman is more likely to have some of them individually.
Yeah, I think it's definitely very healthy to be like exposed to both genders. Like if someone was just exposed to one gender throughout their life, that'd be a really different existence than if they did both. Single ed schools interest me, because I think that having the balance of boys and girls in the one classroom is really beneficial, because that's what real life is like. As soon as you separate them, then that's different to real life.
Indeed, I've actually heard perspectives that sometimes it's best to separate boys and girls in a certain period of their life, especially in their teen years when they're undergoing puberty and the influence of hormones is quite strong, and perhaps they're statistically quite interested in the opposite sex. And the argument being that when you separate them, they're not distracted by each other. But at the same time, that doesn't really teach you to live in a world in which you're interacting with all sorts of people. It teaches you that life is going to be free from distraction, which is never the case. Like, there's always going to be distraction in life, and part of healthy development is to learn to cope with it.
Yeah, so that's why it's interesting, because there's definitely pros and cons to both.
Although some might argue that you're never as distracted as you are in your teen years. I'm not sure what the statistics are on that.
Yeah, everything's a big deal when you're in your teens.
Exactly.
Back in your life, it's really not.
Exactly.
This is the first recording of my laughter made in my entire life. Thank you, Jasmine, for enjoying this special moment with me.
So there is something to be said for controlling emotions, but that philosophy can go too far. Being stoic and not feeling emotion and not acknowledging them at all, if we're able to control emotions that way, it can help in times when our concentration is vital, because, as we said, emotion can distract us and it can affect our ability to make basic decisions and do basic thinking. So being able to control that sometimes is vital, especially in times when survival's a primary concern. But then being detached from them in a way that makes us feel as though they're not important, or makes them feel neglected, that can also be just as unhealthy. And some people take that philosophy to the extreme and say, well, emotions aren't important, or that mental illness isn't important, suck it up and deal with it, which is really problematic. Yeah, we've heard that before, haven't we? It's only with that simple.
The fun one.
Yeah, we've heard that before.
Mm.
There are some situations when our emotions can definitely get the better of us, though, and this is where discussion of mental illness does play a significant part, because, as you said, because sometimes people exaggerate their circumstances, or may also trivialize mental illness and make out like they're having those experiences when they're actually not, and they're just using it for attention, which I'd like to think is only a small minority of people, but unfortunately people do sometimes misrepresent.
Yeah, I think social media definitely makes the minority seem like a majority sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah, because those are the videos that go viral.
Exactly. One of the flip sides to emotion, which is not to say in any way that emotions aren't important, but rather somewhat of an unhealthy way of looking at emotion or addressing emotion, is to say that emotion and validation are everything. And some people might have adopted this philosophy, and there are certain ways that our emotions can get the better of us, and sometimes we give in to them. We can immediately listen to our emotions as a source of all wisdom, or as the primary dictator of how we respond to something. And that can have its own caveats. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, something as simple as like finance, for example. Money itself is very unemotional. It's like a concept or a physical thing. So if you're constantly just giving in to your emotions and they're controlling your life, you could just spend too much money on something, and like you could be low on money, and so you need to prioritize other things. So logic definitely needs to come into it at some point. You can't just let emotion just run everything, because emotion doesn't necessarily have your best interests at heart.
Like you said, reality and external concepts don't have an inherent emotional component. We give them an emotional component. So some things have inherent emotional component, like our relationships with other people, chasing a purpose in life. Often the emotion for that, even if it's just passion, like basic passion, can drive that. Some of the more extreme manifestations come when people might have an emotional disturbance, like, for example, if they have a particular mental illness. And sometimes when people have those experiences, the emotion drives decision making. It's something that I've seen often enough in the world to know that it's something that needs to be addressed, not in a judgmental way, but in a compassionate way. It's about learning how to deal with emotions adaptively, that sometimes people change entire aspects of their lives or make really destructive decisions based on a fleeting emotion. Some people have been taught somehow probably through social media and the spread of pop psychology, that having your feelings validated is the most important thing. It's almost a form of hedonism in which if something doesn't feel good immediately, then it's bad, and if something feels good immediately, and it's good, without consideration for the fact that there are flow-on effects of something, even if it feels bad or good immediately. And social media, as you said, has definitely amplified that, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think people are trying to feel too good sometimes. It's okay to feel bad, it's okay to feel down, it's okay to feel negative emotions as well. I think everyone's just trying to seek too much good throughout schools and stuff like that. Like, I've heard some schools are not doing like first, second, and third, like if they do a race and stuff like that, because they don't want any like losers. But that's not reality. Doing little things like that don't help people control their emotions, because if they've never felt negative ones, then how are you meant to understand them and deal with that?
Exactly. You're absolutely right. It's been the case for a while that schools have been operating that way. And as you said, in reality, people don't always come first. And so what you should teach kids, not that winning is everything, and not that you should take losing passively. Perhaps there's an in-between message, something that's like healthier for kids to learn.
Yeah, and I think this is where like the over-validation comes from. Whereas if they're constantly being told that they're great at absolutely everything that they do, then you're over-validating something. People need to understand their strengths and their weaknesses. Everyone has weaknesses.
Absolutely. I think it's a healthy message for a child to learn. If you lose, don't resent the person who won, and don't spite yourself for it. Look inwards and say, if I want to win next time, what can I do differently to increase my chances of winning? But most importantly, don't give up. Just because you lost this time doesn't mean you're going to lose for the rest of your life. The only way you're going to know if success is possible or not is by keeping up the efforts.
Yeah, the only way to build resilience is to fail.
Absolutely. And you've certainly experienced that, having to build your business a second time. It's certainly, I remember you mentioning in a particular post that you were glad that failure occurred at some stage, because now you've learned something from the alternatives that you took, and now you're bouncing back bigger and better than ever.
Yeah, there's so much that I learned just by having the 2-year gap in between, 2-3 years. There's so many things that I do differently.
Some of the incidences that I think are really quite helpful to reflect on would be what might sometimes happen when our emotions are at their most extreme, and this type of conversation isn't something that we should have with any sort of shame. I'm certainly not suggesting that people should be ashamed of their feelings, or that they should be ashamed or feel excessive guilt for making mistakes, but rather there's something that we can learn from these. I've had clients talk to me about how their relationship with another person, their romantic relationship or their friendship, has almost been ended, or sometimes been ended completely, when in the time space of maybe a few minutes, when everything went from being stable and normal for them to being adversarial, both parties arguing with each other because one party just casually disagreed with something the other said, and all of a sudden the other party became very emotionally heightened, and before you knew it, there was an argument that had escalated. And the issue may not have even been of personal significance. I mean, in those cases, it might have been a political opinion. It might have been an opinion on something that was happening in the world that was relevant to neither party. But one person's opinion conflicted with the other person's opinion, and before you know it, one person's emotions got triggered, the other person's got triggered in turn, and that back and forth motion happened over a matter of minutes before each party decided that it was over. And in those circumstances, the emotion sent a message. Something's not right about the situation, which the emotion itself is neither good or bad, but the way they responded to it ended in complete destruction, something that both of them possibly regretted in some way.
Yeah, and I think understanding why you're feeling the way you're feeling in seemingly insignificant moments can help in significant ones. Because if you understand why you're feeling like sad in calm situations, then being in touch with your emotions, then when it does become really heightened, you've got more knowledge to go, hey, I'm going to say something really dumb. I should just like stop talking for a sec.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's, as you said, even in insignificant moments, anything you learn in life is useful. However, it's just about choosing the ways to use it. So learning about emotions through any moment you can is knowledge you can take with you for the rest of your life. Something that's quite personal to me was my own journey learning about how emotions work. Having a mental illness and having complex trauma, our emotions can sometimes be almost an enemy in some ways, where they get triggered in moments where they don't have to, where there's no survival need. So there are moments in which, I've been talking to someone and something they said that had absolutely nothing to do with me or nothing to do with anything that was even a threat to me could potentially cause me to be triggered. And learning how to analyze those moments was massively insightful to me, because what it taught me was the emotion is not a definite signal that there's a threat. Your emotions were just reminded of something that happened in the past that was a threat, but right now isn't a threat to you.
And I think that's where logic needs to jump in, because in those moments, your emotions don't have your best interests at heart. That's where logic needs to jump in and go, hey, you're not in danger right now. And yeah, logic needs to take over, which it definitely does need to do sometimes, for sure.
It's just a matter of teaching people how to do it teaching logic and compassion to work hand in hand, side by side, so that we don't criticize ourselves for feeling those emotions. We just remind ourselves, or take a minute to talk to ourselves and say, well, I know that there was a threat that happened in the past that whatever this person said reminded me of, but in this very moment, there's no threat. So what I can do is I don't have to respond as if there's a threat. I can choose to do something else to help myself. And it doesn't even have to mean ignoring the emotion. Something that's really helpful for people, really healthy for people who have complex trauma or related illnesses like a borderline personality disorder to do is to be able to talk about their emotions in ways that help them release the tension, but in a way that's constructive rather than destructive. If someone's talking to their partner and they get triggered, rather than being emotionally reactive with their partner, they might say, hey, something you said just triggered me, and I know that wasn't your intention, but can I take a minute to deal with it? And if you have a supportive partner, hopefully you would have discussed strategies to be able to handle that in a healthy and safe way. Unfortunately, not everyone has that, and not everyone has access to that type of information, which I'm slowly trying to be part of the movement to make that type of information more accessible to people. But it's always a work in progress for us as a society. But those are moments where logic and compassion can work hand in hand. And we don't have to ignore emotions, but we don't have to let them be the controller of everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even if you don't have like a partner or anything, trying to figure it out on your own is very, very difficult. So I think that's where professionals come in as well. They can definitely make a huge difference.
Definitely professional help makes a big difference. And also, in the long term, it helps us build a good relationship with the world, because in the end, if our emotions convince us that they're everything, eventually they become weapons. A person who's highly emotional in some way, to an extent that's unhealthy, might start to blame absolutely everything that they experience internally on the external world, and often it has nothing to do with what's happening in the external world. They might be responding to the external world, but the link between what happens outside and what happens inside can be quite complicated. And so if one constantly blames the external world, the likelihood is they're not going to have a very good relationship with them, and then that's going to self-perpetuate. They're going to probably feel a lot worse in the long term. So there's nothing to be ashamed of with regards to emotion, but there are healthy ways to deal with it. And I encourage everyone who's listening today to be a part of not just dealing with your own emotions in a healthy way, but also helping other people too, and being compassionate, because kindness costs nothing. There's enough difficulty in the world already. There's enough adversity. There are enough people who are going to be unkind to you. You don't have to be unkind to someone or practice tough love to teach them resilience. That you're not going to teach them resilience that way. Practice compassion and show them resilience. Like, show them how to be resilient. Don't be the reason that they need resilience. Show them resilience.
Yeah, life's hard enough. Don't add to it.
Exactly. We're all in this together. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode, everybody, and thank you, Jasmine, for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to discuss your perspective on emotion, especially as it's something that's so much at the heart of what you do. I hope everyone obtains something from this discussion.
Yeah, Thank you for having me. It was really great to discuss everything with you.
It's my pleasure. Now, as per usual for our audience today, you should never accept anything on the internet as professional advice. So if you do have concerns about your own welfare or somebody else's welfare, please seek professional guidance. And also, don't take this as a dictation of how to live your life. Take it as one perspective or a number of perspectives that we've discussed that can help stimulate conversation and help us to explore the world collaboratively. And hopefully I'll be hearing from you sometime soon in discussing your own perspectives, whether you might agree or disagree. So until next time, take care.